Happy International Day of Happiness. Welcome to you wherever you are in the world right now. Thank you so much for being here for this special live event, this special celebration of this rather unique day in the year on the theme of caring and sharing, a vital theme at any time of year, and also the theme of the World Happiness Report, which I'm excited to say is being launched today. And I'm particularly pleased to be joined by two fantastic guests for our community gathering this evening, Professor Lara Aknin from Simon Fraser University, and our dear friend, Dr. Radha, who has been a long-standing supporter of Action for Happiness, as well as a GP and a real expert in mental health and well-being. Thank you so much for being here, Radha and Lara.
Hello, Mark. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to join you.
So for anyone who is new to one of these events, welcome to the Action for Happiness community, a movement of people all around the world trying to take action to create a happier and kinder world, not just on the International Day of Happiness today, but in fact, all year round. If you're part of this community, thank you for being here. Thank you for all that you're doing, especially to our volunteers who are spreading so much kindness and well-being in their local communities. Today is this special day because we are celebrating this theme that we all care so much about. And we also have some unique insights from the World Happiness Report. I'm delighted Lara is here to represent the co-authors of that report, share with us some of the findings, and then we'll have Radha to give her expert perspective on how we can apply this in our lives at a time when, let's face it, many of us are dealing with really big challenges to our happiness, both personally and in the world around us. But before we do any of that, let's take a moment just to pause together as a community. Here we are with hundreds of us from all around the world. Take a moment to take a breath wherever you are and just to bring to mind something that's been a source of happiness for you recently. It might be a really happy time generally, but it might be a really difficult time. And yet still, there's very often things that we can still be grateful for, things that are able to give us support and help and inspiration in these times. And I'm going to ask Lara and Radha to do this as well. But let's all try and bring to mind a little thing, a few words, something that has been bringing us happiness. And if you'd like to put your few words in the chat, we'd love to read a few of the community answers out as well. Let me turn to Radha though. Radha, what's something that's been supporting you recently?
It's my dog actually, who you might hear in a few minutes barking away. It's my dog. He's called Bodhi, after the Bodhi tree, which is supposed to represent kind of being in the moment and having some space and time away from all the noise of the world. And he's brought me a lot of happiness and joy lately because he is just unconditionally there, unconditionally cheerful and happy, and he's just been a real source of comfort and peace. And when all the world is very noisy and everything seems sometimes quite difficult, I look at him and I think, no, this is what's important. So yeah, my shout out to my dog Bodhi. There you go.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm seeing in the chat, crocus and daffodils blooming, family, warmer weather, chocolate, phone call with my daughter, playing football with my son, birds in the garden, supportive friends, more puppies mentioned, garden, time by myself, planning a marriage, having time with my sisters, walking in the sunshine, a family vacation, rain after hot weather. Lovely. What about you, Laura? What's been supporting you recently?
I love hearing all of these. I think mine, a very memorable experience that just happened yesterday afternoon, was hearing from an old friend. I received an invitation to a major event for her son, and she and I were the closest of friends all through elementary school. We've been in touch on and off over the years, but to receive this invitation kind of out of the blue for me and my family to join her family was just, it brought tears to my eyes. I was so grateful and honored. And we've been in touch earlier today, just reconnecting, and she mentioned this big milestone didn't seem complete without us there. So it was just so lovely to be reminded of good friendships that last lifetimes.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm seeing in the chat, listening to music, spending time with my 90-year-old grandma, going to the mountains, intimacy with my husband, good food. Wonderful. So let me share one too. So my son turned 14 this week. My youngest is now 14, which is quite remarkable. And as a cyclist, I've been really grateful for the change in temperature in the UK this week. It's gone from being lots of gloves and jackets to like sunshine, and I found myself overdressed rather than underdressed on my bike, which is a nice change. So that's a reminder, I think, that whatever's going on in our lives, there are little glimmers that we can cling on to. But let's come to the serious business of happiness, which is something that isn't just about those momentary feelings of feeling good, but about our overall evaluation of our lives and indeed how that varies around the world. So Lara, let's to lead into that, maybe you'd like to say a little bit about your own background and professional expertise, and then perhaps your involvement in this World Happiness Report and what that is.
Certainly. So I am a social psychologist by training. I've done a PhD in experimental social psychology, and I am an editor of the World Happiness Report now. And probably about 5 years ago or so, I contributed a chapter to the World Happiness Report, kind of on a similar idea on financial forms of generosity, various forms of generosity. And it was such a delight. And I got a chance to kind of read the other chapters, give feedback on the other chapters. And as a result, I was invited to join the editorial team. And so a few years later, I'm still here enjoying reading the work. And I feel it is such an important contribution to the academic community, but to the world, because I see the World Happiness Report as an annual enterprise, really trying to bring the best of well-being science to policymakers, to decision makers, but also to the general public, so people can hear what are some of the clearest and I think approachable insights from the field.
Thank you. And thank you to your colleagues as well for all of the insights. It's been wonderful actually to see the media engagement and the interest around the world. We've had some coverage on the BBC News today, talking about the findings of the report, and I know it's been picked up all around the world. Radha, many in the community will already be familiar with your amazing work. I think when we think of happiness in the current conversation, we sometimes think of a rather sort of trivialized, sort of smiley happy. And yet, of course, what you see in your work all the time is the very real struggles that so many of us have in our lives. And there's a sort of deeper meaning to this idea of a truly happy life that includes our resilience, our ability to cope with life's tough times. Remind us about your experience and how that links to this topic of happiness.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So I'm a medical doctor. Started off as in hospital medicine, then moved into primary care, into general practice. But I've always been interested in people's stories and how they've got into the consultation room, what's been happening in the rest of their lives, what challenges they faced, and how our bodies, our minds, and our emotional systems all link in together, and that we're not just one thing only. My sort of passion for that started about 15, 16 years ago. And one of my big interests is, how can we actually overcome a challenge? How can we thrive through challenge? How can we learn from each other? How can we listen to other people's stories and tips and advice and tricks and kind of use that to help ourselves? And in that process, bond together and be more cohesive really as a society and as a world. And I was lucky enough to obviously be the trustee for Action for Happiness. And so one of my big things really is, how do we get through life? How do we manage this? And what can we share from across the world, from different countries and cultures, that will help all of us? I think that's something that we can all dig into, and actually is one of the most important sort of life skills, but also one of the most important bits of wisdom I think we can gain from being a human being on the planet, if that's not too big a statement.
Yeah, well said. Now, the theme of this event, and indeed of the World Happiness Report this year, is caring and sharing. And we will in a moment come to some of the new insights about kindness and benevolence and the togetherness aspect of the report. But before we do that, Lara, I think we should probably start with the thing that the journalists all immediately jump to with the report, which is it includes a ranking of countries by happiness. So maybe you'd like to say a little bit about what that is, and also maybe what some of the headline findings are in terms of happiness around the world. Which countries are happiest? How are some of the countries we might know and love, like the UK or the US, doing? Over to you.
Certainly. Yes. So the one feature of the World Happiness Report that receives probably the most attention comes from Chapter 2, which is the global rankings. These rankings are national averages that look at how people within various countries report their life evaluation as a whole on what's called the Cantrell ladder. And so it's a measure that asks people it's a one-item question that asks people to imagine a ladder that it's got 11 rungs. It goes from 0 at the very bottom to 10 at the very top. And it asks people to place themselves on this imaginary ladder, where 0 is their worst possible life and 10 is their best possible life. And so usually the Gallup World Poll poses this question to about 1,000 people every year across 140 or so countries. And here at the World Happiness Report team and in the Gallup team as well, we compile and look at the average ratings within a country in a given year, but then actually for the rankings look across 3 years. So we get a more robust and precise estimate. And it is those averages that form the national rankings. So this year, not unlike the past few years, Finland is at the very top. I believe it is its 8th year in a row. Sometimes people find this perhaps, I mean, Finland is a wonderful place to be. But I think sometimes even the Finnish themselves are a little surprised to see themselves at the top, because they say that they're not skipping around up and down the streets exuberant with joy. But I think this taps into something you were just saying, Mark and Radha, which is that it's not necessarily about always just the short-term happiness. It's about a broader contentment with one's life. So maybe that will come up in conversation later. But the other key finding is that both the United States and the UK are out of the top 20. I believe the UK is in 23, which is the lowest spot it's been in quite some time, and the US has dipped one spot further than it was last year. And Canada, where I am, is just within that cusp of the top 20, which has raised some kind of questions about what are these predictors of life satisfaction across the globe, and how can we try to understand what is shaping these responses.
Thanks, Lara. I'm just going to, for a moment, share a summary that Gallup used today to show the top 10 and the bottom 10 from your list in the report. As you say, Finland is at the top, and we see this clustering of Northern European countries, so the Scandinavian countries generally doing well. Also some new joiners in the top 10, Mexico and Costa Rica. Interesting to see countries in other parts of the world making it into the top 10 for the first time. Also, I guess when we talk about happiness, people think about, the feelings of well-being, but at the other end of the spectrum, this does really represent the opposite of happiness, the suffering that we see in areas particularly like Afghanistan and Sierra Leone and Lebanon, where there has been suffering and conflict. Understandably, those sorts of places are dealing with really, really severe unhappiness, and that's important as well. So why is it, I wonder then, that these Northern European countries do so well? I mean, I tend to find that this theme of trust, which we may come back to, is an important one. A lot of these countries have very strong trust in each other, in institutions, in a sense of community solidarity. But Radha, I know you've done some work on thinking on this before. What do you tend to see in terms of why some of those countries in Northern Europe tend to foster happiness and well-being in a way that perhaps we wish we could do more of here?
Yeah, I mean, a complex question with no simple answer, but I think some of the 3 elements that I always come back to when I'm talking about happiness or well-being or contentment. I think, Lara, that you make such a good point about contentment and sort of being contented with life rather than sort of fleeting moments of happiness, which is what we tend to think of, isn't it, when we hear the word happiness? But I come back to sort of people, place and purpose. So people as in that individual, maybe the skills that they've learned or they've been sort of supported to develop when they've been growing up or within their family, but also people in terms of connection and sort of society, how well connected people feel, how sort of safe they feel, held and seen and heard and valued. And then place. So I think a big one for some of the countries at the top there, in my view, would be around environment, exposure to green spaces, to blue spaces, that connection between the natural world and the individual or society, for example, but also place in terms of how their local community is structured, how integrated that sort of structure is in terms of community, how well connected people feel to their place in terms of heritage and identity, and who they are, and then purpose, which again you can divide into sort of two spaces or maybe 3 spaces, that individual, and again kind of how sort of valued they feel, the direction they can see themselves going in terms of maybe the political structure or cohesion, the direction that they feel their nation is going in, and their life is going in. But also I think purpose in terms of where the world is going. And again, sometimes our expectations in different countries or different cultures can be different. So therefore the rating perhaps on which we we put on that scale, that ladder scale that Laura was talking about, can be different as well. But I think for me, a lot of the countries at the top of that list have a very strong sense of environment and nature, but they also have a very strong tradition of coming together to do things together, to take time together, and to value that perhaps more over that kind of busy, let's work, let's kind of get in a robotic sort of escalator style of sort of achieving this and achieving that, but not really necessarily having insight into actually what makes us feel good and what can sustain our energy and our activity in those areas as well. Because fundamentally, if we're contented, if we get those sort of foundation stones right, then actually everything else thrives from that. So people tend to be more productive at work, and the economy tends to improve. So it's getting those fundamentals right. And I think sometimes the countries at the top of that list have probably realised that maybe before some of the other countries in the list as well.
Thank you, Radha. Lara, I'm actually tempted to pivot from what Radha's just said to one of the findings. I was going to come to this a bit later, but one of the findings in your report is about togetherness, and particularly about the importance of some ways in which we get together and gather, and particularly meal times and eating together. Would you like to share that finding with us?
Certainly. So one chapter in this year's report looks at some data regarding meal sharing and how it is correlated with people's well-being reports. And simply put, people who share more meals with other people, that is, they eat side by side with another person, at least one other person, report higher levels of well-being. And there's almost a pretty impressive linear path such that more meals are associated with higher levels of happiness. This is focusing on lunch and dinners, where people can, and in many ways, have the opportunity to gather. I think it's fascinating because shared meals might be a very clear indicator of the extent to which our lives are structured to allow social contact and social connection. And that, I think, might be actually a nice tie back to some of the predictors of happiness around the globe. One of the key and consistent findings that we see year after year in the report, and I'm happy to talk about all the predictors, but one key one is having at least one person to count on in times of need. And if you think about it, that is what I would think of as the most basic, fundamental assessment of social connection. Do you have one person you can call if you're in a car accident or in trouble and need a hand? And so folks who have that tend to report significantly higher levels of happiness. And I think one way to go about fostering those social connections, those important relations, is spending time with other people. And so sitting side by side with others, sharing meals, is a really important predictor. And that finding is presented in a same chapter that shows the rates of people eating alone have increased substantially over the past several decades. I believe it's something like this rate has increased by 50-something% or so over the past 2 decades. And so we're missing out perhaps on an opportunity to share meals, to share time with other people, and to perhaps boost our happiness from doing so.
Thank you, Lara. Yeah, well, I'll turn to Radha and reflect on why this might be going on and how we can respond to it. But I guess some things come up for me. You know, some of the post-pandemic shifts to remote working may have taken us away from socializing with our colleagues around lunchtimes. I think in a screen-dominated culture, we may be with our loved ones at home, but staring at screens rather than connecting and spending time together. More of us may be living alone or being more isolated. Perhaps we might say that work and life pressures mean that we've got less time to relax and eat together. So it feels as though we maybe need to be, but I always love what our friend Professor Bob Waldinger says about how we should be working on our social fitness just as much as our physical fitness. That actually really consciously saying taking time to connect and be with people is really vital. It's not just a nice to have, it's something that's really worth investing time in. Radha, what comes up for you when you hear that finding?
Well, just first of all, the point about physical fitness, because we know as well that when you eat together, you tend to eat more slowly. You probably tend to eat food which is probably healthier for you,
Yeah.
And you're more mindful about how you eat. So actually, you know, again, the body is not separate from the mind. So that's also quite an interesting point. But I think for me, so 3 things really. That kind of evolutionary aspect of it, as Laura was saying, that most basic need to eat. And if you think back to, you know, when we were kind of, you know, in caves and we were kind of hunting together as tribes, you know, that's how people came together. that was one of the main activities where, you know, that tribe or that group of people could be together, to sit together, to eat together, and it was almost very related, wasn't it, to survival, and survival of that tribe was food and hunting, kind of eating those sort of spoils together. So that evolutionary aspect, I suppose. But then also that nurturing. So as Lara said, you know, that idea that, you know, sort of when you offer people food, you eat together, that shows care and attention. And coming from a family which has Indian heritage as well, that was very much part of the message. You know, when someone would arrive, you'd offer them food, come and eat together. So that sense of being nurtured, being looked after in that very basic kind of need of needing to eat and have nutrition. And then I suppose the other aspect is the experiential aspect. So when we cook together, when we're preparing meals together, there's that sense that actually we're experiencing a shared event or a shared experience. And that also then relates to forming memories, having pleasant ideas and memories of the food we've cooked together, and that process. And this is why actually doing things together, being active with someone else, actually forms those kind of memories which are linked to positive emotions. And when we go back into our minds and think about that time we cooked together, or we ate together, we not only remember that event, but we also get that link of the associated emotion of joy or of happiness. So quite a few different aspects there, but definitely one to remember, I think, for all of us.
Thank you, Radha. Well said. And I think that's the happiness of your dog that you mentioned earlier that we're hearing has rejoined you now as part of your own family time together. So that's nice. Lara, let's turn to what I think is the most heartwarming in some ways, and perhaps most relevant to Action for Happiness of all the findings in this year's happiness report, which I paraphrase as we're kinder than we think we are, or something along those lines. But maybe you can say a bit more about what's behind that statement and whether I've got that right.
Yes. Yeah. So I think your shorthand is a nice summary. So one of my favorite findings sounds like one of yours too, from this year's report, that kind of receives a well-received amount of attention, is this intriguing finding that people are kinder than we assume. So in chapter 2 of this year's report, we present some of the evidence demonstrating that when people are in multiple experiments, they're called the wallet drop experiments. Researchers have gone around the globe and kind of dropped wallets in public spaces and assessed the frequency or the likelihood of these wallets being returned. And that provides, if you will, kind of a direct, observable measure of people going out of their way, stepping out of their daily routine to help a complete stranger, returning what is likely some pretty important and vital information. Researchers have also been able to ask people, what is the likelihood, if you were to lose your wallet, what is the likelihood that it would be returned to you by various different people, including a stranger, a neighbor, and a police officer? And this presents a beautiful array of data because it allows you to look at, first and foremost, whether people are accurate about how likely their wallet is to be returned. And the short answer is no. People are overly pessimistic about the likelihood of wallets being returned. And maybe I should pause there to emphasize that it's not like we're off by a smidgen. We're often underestimating the likelihoods of wallets being returned by usually an order of magnitude that is, in some studies, the actual rates are in the 80s, but the actual rate of wallets being returned are in 80% or so. But people's perceptions are hovering around 20%, suggesting we are drastically underestimating the kindness of our neighbors and community, our fellow community members. And that's worth acknowledging, that people are kinder than we think they are. But also extremely important is that our perceptions of others matter in quite a significant fashion for our own happiness. So if we assume the worst of others, if we are navigating this world thinking it's just minutes away from us being mugged on the subway or the tube, you can imagine walking down the street clutching your purse. You interact with the world in a very different fashion than if you do thinking that this person next to you is likely to return your wallet should you drop it. And consistent with that kind of thought experiment I provide right there, the data align very nicely with that to show that people who assume or who expect a wallet to be returned report significantly higher levels of happiness than those who do not. And this estimate is on par with something like unemployment or actually facing negative life events. And so it's a pretty significant finding.
Well, it really struck me in the report, and then it's been a lovely connection with a whole range of media engagement today. So the BBC journalist took 10 wallets with contact details into Belfast, which is the happiest area in Northern Ireland in the UK, and lost 10 wallets. And well, guess, audience members, how many of the 10 were then returned by a stranger that found them later that day? I was hopeful that it might be, 8 or 9. And it was actually, people are guessing 9, but as Catherine has said in the chat, all of them. Yeah, in fact, in this experiment, I know it's not as valid as the detailed research, but somebody recreated this today on BBC and all 10 were returned. And I'm drawn to a comment that I saw someone put in the chat a moment ago, which is this something to do with the negativity we see in the news? I would posit that it's quite understandable that we think people are perhaps unkind, perhaps can't be trusted, because we're bombarded with stories and news that highlights that element of human nature, which is there. And what we don't spend enough time focusing on is all the goodness that is around us all the time, the natural generosity and benevolence. And in fact, when you stop and notice it, people are just generally good and keen to help each other. And that we overlook that. It's not only sad that we overlook that, but as you say, Lara, it's a missed opportunity to create a higher well-being and more trusting society. So Radha, what does this bring up for you? Because I'm sure you must see people in your work who are feeling scared of others or untrusting or perhaps worried about how others might be treated. And I find myself feeling encouraged by the idea that others are kinder than we think they are. How does it seem to you?
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point about that sort of negative sort of cognitive bias we have, don't we? So we hear, maybe a number of news stories, and maybe even if we hear 9 of those are good ones, but one is, a bad one, we'll tend to always focus on the bad one. Just like if one person criticizes us, but everyone else for that day says nice things about us, we'll only tend to remember that one negative comment. So our brains are designed to do that for the reason that actually apparently we're supposed to be protecting ourselves, or it's a strategy where we see a threat, and so we focus on that to keep ourselves safe. So I think even being aware of that, being aware of our tendency, all of us, to do that is quite helpful and quite important, because it means that we can try to reframe things. I also think, during the pandemic, I did a lot of work around news stories and about how much news we were consuming, but also potentially how negative that news was. And so again, looking at the impact of that on our mental health. So, how negative, how much negative news are we listening to or reading, what we're exposing ourselves to, and actually how can we sort of manage our feeds of our news a bit better, to include not to necessarily understand about the world or what's going on, but just to have a little bit more time away, space away from that, and also to look at what's going on in our local community, our local news, so we can actually rebalance that. I think is also helpful for our own mental health. That's also so that if we have good mental health, we can then go out into the world and we have the energy to then help other people. So there is a balance, I think, to be said for that. But yeah, I think this story was fantastic, and I saw it on BBC News myself actually just before this webinar started, and it's great, because I think we are constantly being told this is really bad, this is really awful. Be very, very careful around this, be very, very careful about it, be very, very cautious. And of course, we absolutely do need to be in the right circumstances. But fundamentally, I think we need to get back to a place where actually we're erring on the side of trusting more than on the side of fearing, in balance. But that for us all, I think, is healthier for our minds and our emotional systems.
I really love that point, Radha. Thank you. And I think what you're hinting at is this idea of positive spirals and things that build on each other in constructive ways, rather than getting stuck in these sort of doom loops and negative spirals. And in fact, when we recognize kindness around us, it makes us more likely to trust others and then do kind things, which has a ripple effect. And as you say, we can't pour from an empty cup. So when we feel more nourished and safe, we're more likely to look out for others. And then when we hear these stories, it inspires more. So again, it feels like the world is trying to send a message to us today. But my dear colleague Vanessa, who many in the community will know, just messaged us earlier to say, oh my goodness, this is coming true in real life. She just found a lost wallet in the park on her way home. I managed to return it to someone sort of live today, completely unexpectedly. And I would just like to say a thank you to Carolyn in our community, who was part of the Belfast team that was involved in that BBC footage and is one of many Action for Happiness volunteers that run local groups that are trying to spread kindness and togetherness in communities. So, Lara, back to you.
I was going to ask if I could add one thing, and maybe
Please.
this is exactly where you're going. I apologize for interrupting, but I just wanted to put a shout out to one other, what I think, fascinating finding in the report, and I believe it's chapter 6 on youth, because the researchers in that chapter really tried to see if they could intervene and improve people's perceptions of one another, and in fact, they were able to. So it turns out that with some repeated presentation of these positive facts, we can kind of overcome what the researchers call this empathy gap, this gap between the actual rates of helping behavior and what we anticipate, our pessimistic perceptions. And that's by, I mean, this was done at Stanford University through postering all around campus, kind of advertising the positivity and the kindness of fellow students, and through interventions where people were reminded on their phone through various text messages that your fellow students are happy and willing to help. And so just wanted to put a plug in for the promise and possibility there of maybe closing this gap, and which has been shown to increase people's interactions, their willingness to take these social risks, to have conversations, to interact with others, and their well-being follows in turn.
I really love that idea that what we really need is a marketing campaign for the goodness in human nature. I remember I once had the pleasure of meeting Alain de Botton, the wonderful philosopher and writer, who said, if we could just take a fraction of the creative energy that goes into selling us stuff that we don't really need and use that energy to advertise things that really make life good around kindness and generosity, then the world will be a better place. Maybe that's what Action for Happiness is really trying to do, to encourage more generosity and kindness. So thank you all for being part of this antidote to the world's cynicism. And on that note, I'm sure you as the audience have lots of questions for Lara about the report and for Radha's expertise. And so please do add them into the Q&A here, and we'll come to some of those in a moment. But I'd like us, first of all, to lean into a campaign that we've been running today that builds on all the stuff we've been talking about and that we can all do together right now. And it's on this theme of caring and sharing. And some of you, I hope, will have already seen this. But if you go to dayofhappiness.net, and my colleague, I'm sure, will put this into the chat. Thank you, Sarah, as always, for supporting us. We have a campaign site for today on this theme of caring and sharing. And we're trying to encourage 1 million extra acts of caring and sharing. And we've had an amazing response. And there are 3 steps that we can take to do this. And I'd love us to try this. So wherever you are in the world right now, take a moment to pause. And we're going to do these 3 steps. Step 1 is think of something that you found helpful or inspiring recently. We're all facing challenges in our lives. We've had difficult times. Maybe it's something you've read, something you've seen, an idea, a course you discovered, a podcast, something you saw in a book, a place you went to, something that really was supportive for you and your own mental health and well-being, or your relationships, something you did with a loved one. That's quite personal to you, but hopefully something comes to mind. Step 2, now think about someone who might benefit from that thing that's helped you. It might be a loved one or a close friend, or it could be someone at work or a WhatsApp group you're on, or a neighbor that you could pop round and see. The point here is to try and bring to mind someone specific and use this as an opportunity to reconnect with them. Because then, as we see here in step 3, how are you going to get in touch with that person and just share this thing with them? And what I love about this is there's so many ways we can do that. You can pick one that feels relevant to you. It could be a digital way. It could be, sending a message, but it could also be a rather more old-fashioned way. Pick up the phone, wave to a neighbor, pop around and say hello, go over and talk to a colleague. It's giving ourselves permission to reform those connections, that togetherness that Lara and Radha were talking about. And I like this suggestion. And in fact, I have to give Radha a lot of credit for, because she was helping us shape this. But when we think of something that's helped us, it almost gives us a hook to start a conversation with someone, to say, look, I don't know about you, but this really helped me. And I just wanted to sort of let you know in case it helps you. And it's a conversation starter. It's an opportunity. So Radha, given you've given this idea some thought, do you want to say a bit more about that? Maybe something that you'd like to pass on? What comes up for you when you think about this action?
I think when I think about this action, I really love to come back just to the basics and the really simple things. I think sometimes when we when we think about happiness or well-being, sometimes the conversation can get quite complex and seem quite complicated and quite overwhelming. And I think given what's happening in the world at the moment and what we've been through over the last 5-6 years, I think just trying to sort of reframe happiness and this sort of idea of caring and sharing, I think it's really helpful to bring it back to very simple, basic steps. So for me, it's about kind of literally, you come across someone in your day, a friend, a colleague, and actually kind of asking them how they are, but also sharing something really, really simple, or sharing how maybe a time when you felt how they felt. I think that's really important. I think sometimes we can feel very alone in our feelings, particularly if we're going through a difficult time. And in my life, if I've had a difficult period or something's happened to me that's really tricky, the most helpful thing that I've had, or the support I've had from other people, is not necessarily advice or them telling me what to do or suggesting something. It's actually just them saying, when something similar happened to me, I felt like this, and this is what really helped me. Or similarly saying, when that happened to me, it was really tough, and there was nothing particularly I could do to make it go away or to fix it, but with time it did get better, and I'm here for you. So I think that's just a very small example, but trying to just really bring it back to basics. And I think trying to bring it back to that commonality and that universality of the emotions that we all feel and the experiences that we all go through, not only helps us sort of to feel good and to get ideas about what could help us feel better, but more importantly, it makes us feel not so alone, and it brings us together. And again, going back to what Lara was saying about connection and community, that's really, our relationships are really the mainstay of what keeps us well. So that would be probably what it'd be for me.
Thanks, Radha. I think you put that beautifully. Lara, does that bring up for you any other aspects of the report or anything else personally that you wanted to share at this point?
Well, I love the idea of thinking about an act of kindness that you have received and passing it on to someone else. I think that's so nicely aligned with the theme of this year's report, and also really digs into the literature showing that, people are happy when they engage in acts of kindness. They're also happy when they pass them along. And even just simply reflecting on the kindness that we've received from others, it feels like this is a beautifully designed challenge and intervention and support. So I'm really thrilled to hear about it.
Thank you. So we're going to come to Q&A. So if you have a question for Lara or Radha, please put it in the questions and answer rather than the chat, because it's easier to find out. And if you'd like another person's question, please give it a thumbs up, and then it will rise up the list and be more likely to get asked. Just as a pivot before we go there, I wanted to just mention one other aspect of the World Happiness Report that I was grateful to see. A friend and colleague, Michael Plant, has written and contributed to a chapter looking at the cost effectiveness of different interventions that are trying to help boost happiness and well-being. And this lovely idea of well-bees, the well-being life year, and how effectively can we help someone improve their well-being in a measurable way, at what cost? And I'm delighted to say that Action for Happiness appears in that list as one of the more cost-effective ways that you can help support people's well-being. So thank you to everyone in our community that's contributed to all the various things we're doing that allows independent researchers to evaluate us and show that it's good value for money as a charity. So Lara, anything more you wanted to say on that chapter at all?
It's a wonderful chapter, definitely worth a read. I was blown away by their computations and ratings, and just simply evaluating and providing data to suggest that charities vary drastically in the degree to which they support well-bees. I think this conceptualization, this way of thinking about charity effectiveness, is a really helpful one. And just seeing the variety and bringing data to bear on this question, I thought was a really useful step in the right direction. So the chapter is definitely worth a read. So I don't know what number it is, but it'll be easy to find in there.
And in the spirit of gratitude and acts of kindness, some of the people here, the many hundreds who are here today, have chosen to make a donation to Action for Happiness in order to attend this event. So thank you for doing that. And please know that that's going towards a cost-effective way of supporting people's well-being. Now, let's come to some questions. Gemma's asked, what's one area where you think an increase in happiness and well-being would have the greatest impact on wider society?
Is that for me or for Radha?
Well,
Sorry.
I mean, I think I might turn to you first in the report context, but I'd love to hear Radha's thoughts as well. What are some of the thematic areas, I guess, that can have the biggest wider impact for society's overall well-being?
Well, I think this raises an interesting point that I think you and I, Mark, talked about just the other day, which is when we're trying to understand variations in happiness rankings around the globe, there are 6 factors we often use to try to predict that variation. Everything from GDP per capita, freedom to make life choices, to healthy life expectancy, and so on. But there are 2 that are really my favorite that tap into this year's themes, but I also think are just factors that are often overlooked. And one is that basic level of social connection we talked about earlier, and the other is whether people have engaged in a generous act in the past month. As you can see, the themes of caring and sharing there. And so, while I don't know if they both have strong impacts on people's happiness. They're both strongly correlated with well-being reports. But one of the reasons I think they're so important to underscore and value is because these are some of the factors that I think an average individual has some control and volition over. It's very unlikely that each of us is going to have a drastically whopping impact on GDP per capita or something similar in terms of these predictors. And so I think investing in social connections and spending our time and energy supporting others through various forms of benevolence or charitable giving or kindness kind of provide a personal sense of volition, a way to give back, and a really approachable, tractable way to improve our own well-being that often and beautifully by design, I think, also improve the well-being of others.
Thank you. Radha, I often find that you're an expert in sort of media and communications, and I often find myself feeling frustrated that a lot of the general news conversation doesn't really link back to happiness and well-being. And yet I feel that what we're talking about is fundamental to so much of what's going on around us. So when it comes to the cost of living, that kind of anxiety that comes from that is all about well-being. When it comes to the sort of polarization and political division we're seeing in our country, a lot of that is about trust and connection and feeling cared for or isolated and so on. So I think so many of the conversations that are in our day-to-day news actually come back to, are people feeling well? Are they feeling anxious? Are they feeling supported? What do you think are some of the areas that are most relevant?
I think that's so true. And I think whenever we talk about happiness, we have to look at the obstacles to happiness, as well as looking at the things that create happiness. We have to look at the things that detract from our happiness so that we can create some, but we also need to kind of tackle and reduce the others. So I think for me, just 3 areas that come up that aren't really spoken about very much, but have a big impact on us, I think are our workplace sort of happiness and our working lives, because, we're all working an extraordinary number of hours per day. Work has a big impact on how we feel, what we bring home, for example, after that day at work or after that, 8 hours of screen time. So looking at, I think workplace wellbeing is really, really important, and getting employers on board as well as employees to kind of tackle both sides. I think the other area for me is probably intergenerational sharing. So when we're looking at people getting older, potentially becoming more isolated because of health conditions or maybe stigma from society, but also looking at children and the skills that we're teaching them at school about happiness and well-being, and letting those kind of generations cross over and learn from each other, and bringing generations together, I think is also great for cohesion as an extra layer. And I think the natural world is something which gives back to us. We need it for our physical survival, but also our emotional survival. So we know how great nature is in terms of the direct impact on our blood pressure and cortisol and pulse rates. But also that nurturing that goes 2 ways, I think, within that. And also, that kind of the natural world gives us an opportunity to come together and to bond as a community and to connect. So those 3 areas I think we don't really talk about very much, but they're ones that I think are important. And I completely agree with you, Mark, that actually, if you look at any sort of news story or anything that we talk about or anything that's topical, ultimately the foundation of that is our happiness, our well-being, our psychology, how we're looking at things, how we're thinking about things. So yeah, these are fundamental skills. And I think if we can try to make them, as Lara and an incredible group are doing, and lots of other people around the world doing, if we can try and make those conversations into hard, tangible data and facts, then I think different audiences then sit up and listen, and they can see the science behind that, they can see the evidence behind that, and we need to kind of take the conversation from sometimes people thinking it's a bit ethereal into a space where actually this is tangible, this is hard, important stuff, and we can actually then find hard, important strategies that are going to impact it and make it better.
Well, I very much agree with that. And I liked your point about intergenerational understanding, and that also bridges to the most upvoted question here from Kerry, which I think I'll take to you, Lara, given it's about the report. But it says, well, Kerry's observed that generations seem to have perhaps different values in general, and so there might be differences between Gen Z or boomers and so on. So the question to you is, how do these different cohort groups perform in the data? So maybe are there differences in happiness or kindness or perceptions at different age groups, for example?
Yes, thank you for that question, Carrie. For the most detailed answer, I'll direct you kindly to last year's report, where our focus really was on generational differences in well-being. And we also, it will have way more statistics and details than I'll be able to rattle off the top of my head. But long story short is, when we parse the data by various kind of cohorts or generational buckets, we see that it can differ quite drastically. I think one of the biggest news stories last year was that young adults, those under the age of 30 in Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, but especially concentrated in Canada and the United States, when ranked by countries, were 30 countries below or more the average happiness report, because older adults in the United States and Canada, for instance, were in the top 10, but young adults under the age of 30s were in the 60th ranking or so, suggesting that there are some significant gaps in life perceptions across the lifespan. Typically, what we see in data documented over the years is kind of a U-shape in happiness across the lifespan. People reporting the highest levels of life satisfaction in their 20s, 30s. It kind of dips in the 40s and 50s and then shows an increase as people head into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. That is still observable in global data, but in certain pockets of the world, that early part of the U had flattened entirely and turned into kind of just an upward slope. And so there's an abundance of data in last year's report, but all this to say that, in different places in the world, across the world, and in different parts of the life trajectory, people are at least now reporting differences in life evaluations. The values people have and pursue does and can change across the lifespan. One of my favorite theories from social psychology is Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory, which is a mouthful. But long story short is that it explains that when people approach later years in life, they prioritize the things that they know, they love, and they care about. Whereas at the younger ages, people take a more exploratory approach to how they pursue life. They're willing to stay in these low-cost hostels as they travel to kind of see the world. But as people age, they're willing to, prioritize their time, their money, their effort on the few key sites or the few key places that they really want to see. That's just one example. So you're right. Values do change across the lifespan, and life satisfaction rates do change across the lifespan. And last year's report will have an abundance of details on where and how those interact.
I have always understood why that U-shaped curve with age sort of might have a trough in the middle, because of course in midlife we're maybe raising a family, we're maybe helping support aging parents, we're in the middle of our most stressful times at work and so on. But the thing that seems heartbreaking in many ways is that so many younger people are not as happy as they were, especially in some of what you might think of as the most privileged countries. And so Radha, maybe we could spend a moment on that. So many of us have been influenced by Jonathan Haidt's work about the anxious generation and sort of the role of perhaps social media and technology in affecting young people's lives. I'm really struck by the sort of ongoing impact post-pandemic on certain cohorts of young people. In the UK at the moment, there's a big debate about the really rising numbers of young people that are not in either education or work and are going straight into sort of sickness absence, which is obviously a cause for us to want to help them, but to actually help them create something that gives their lives meaning and purpose. And so it feels like another topic we see a lot of with Action for Happiness is much higher levels of anxiety, particularly for younger people. And I wonder actually if this message in this year's report about the world as a kinder place than we're told it is actually might be a really important antidote to this sense of anxiety and uncertainty. It's not going to solve any of these problems particularly, but I wonder, Radha, any other reflections of what's going on with the challenges for young people's well-being right now?
Yeah, I mean, you raised some really important topics there, don't you, around social media, exposure to news all the time, but also the pressure I think young people are under in terms of, things are get more and more competitive these days in terms of jobs and prospects, and all they're hearing about is you're never going to own a house, you're not going to get a job that's stable, and these jobs that exist now won't exist in 20 years time or 10 years time. The economic situation of the world, conflicts, the environment, climate crisis. I mean, these are all huge topics. And if you were to take an individual and, one person and say, right, you've got your relationships here, you've got your work life here, you've got your health here, maybe one of those areas would kind of go awry at any one time and you could manage. But if they all kind of are juggling up in the air and feeling very uncertain, it's very, very difficult to keep your feet on the ground. And I think that's how it feels for young people in particular, that all of these different areas and the things that they have to look forward to, or the things that they need to be stable or have some sense of stability, are completely just up in the air at the moment. And it's very difficult for them to find any kind of rooting or any grounding in anything that feels safe and secure, and anything that feels hopeful, I think, sometimes as well. I think there's also a sense of sometimes feeling, well, what can I do about it? And that sense of kind of learned hopelessness, they call it. So when whatever you do doesn't seem to make a difference, you eventually will give up trying to make a difference, because you will think that there is no point to what you do, and that's not effective. And that whole sense of autonomy, my ability to make things happen and to choose. So I think that's really missing for young people at the moment, their voice. Their feeling of effectiveness, and they are incredible. Young people are incredible, which is why I love doing things with them and working with them, and they have so much to offer. But I think either the narrative about young people, or the opportunities, or the space we give them to allow their voice to be heard has been minimised. And I just think that is a big thing that we could do for them, that would be quite direct, and would have a big impact, is to allow them to have a voice and to feel like they have a purpose and they can change something. So that sounds very negative and very miserable. I'm not meaning to be, but I think in order for us to support young people, we need to be able to sort of trust them, give them their voice, and to allow them to affect change that's going to affect them, in their lifetime. So there are lots of good things that are going on for young people. There are lots of organisations and people who are working really hard to support young people. But I think, we sometimes negate what they've been through in terms of the pandemic specifically. And I think we also don't really give them, I think, the kudos that they deserve in terms of what they can do. And I think that's where we could make a big shift for them quite easily, actually, without much resource. I think if our attitudes changed, then that could do a lot of good for them.
And I think that one of the things we can do, and I very much agree with that, it comes back to the main finding from this year's report, Lara, about this idea of, if we can help people recognize the kindness in the world around them, that can help boost their own well-being and rebuild their sense of trust and togetherness. And I'm struck by this idea that I've been trying to hold on to in my own life, which is, when I see something that's negative or cynical or makes me bring out the worst in the world, maybe I don't need to pass that on to lots of other people. But when I see something that is a helpful, hopeful, inspiring thing, maybe I should be amplifying it and sharing it. And actually, that's the little role I can play in choosing what I pass on through my own ripple effect. And so I'd love us to turn to Joshua's question here as we begin to wrap up this event, and perhaps, to build on a sense of hope at a time when, as Radha says, there were many people dealing with challenges. Joshua's asked, what brings you the most hope and or optimism for humanity about the learnings in today's report? So Lara, what comes up for you?
There's so many nuggets in this report that I find inspiring and optimistic, but I think one of my favorites is a point I mentioned earlier about the effectiveness of these interventions closing that empathy gap. That yes, we might underestimate the kindness of our neighbors, of the strangers living next door, but that they are kinder than we expect, and that we can learn to appreciate that kindness with kind of persistent reminders and information. And so I think I hope I see optimism in that these misperceptions can be guided and made more accurate. But I also I'm optimistic about what that might bring. I think that might bring higher levels of well-being, as we talked about recognizing the kindness of neighbors matters for our own well-being, but I also see an optimism that might actually change the norms and keep encouraging more and more pro-social behavior, because once we realize we're not in the minority doing the kind deeds, we're actually in good company, I think that might proliferate these acts even further.
Wonderful. Radha, what's giving you a sense of optimism or hope?
So I think it's along the same theme as Lara's, which is kindness. But I think for me, it's around the fact that not only are most of us, majority of us are kind, and that's incredible because that means everything. But actually that we're still kind even in the face of huge challenge. It's very easy to be kind when things are easy, but when things are difficult, it's much harder. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of reserve and a lot of energy. And given what's been going on in the world and how everyone's feeling, I think the fact that that kindness is there, even in the face of that, is even more hopeful. And that's what I think is actually really beautiful about the report.
I'm just going to invite everyone, wherever you are in this event, thank you for staying with us through this wonderful conversation. What's something that you're going to take forward or you find inspiring or hopeful, either from this conversation or from the report or from this theme of caring and sharing? We'll read a few of them out. Maybe it's you want to join Action for Happiness. Maybe you want to go and share this idea of acts of caring and sharing with others. Maybe you want to pass on the World Happiness Report, remind people there's more goodness in the world than they realize. I'll read a few of these out in a moment. My own answer to this question is, I think seeing that countries, for example, like Costa Rica and Mexico have become happier reminds us that it is possible to create change. So often we think things are getting, quotes, worse, and we forget to notice all the amazing progress that is being made in so many communities. And so at a macro level, like a whole country, we can be happier, but at an individual and a local level, our little actions really do make a difference. That's the whole message of being part of this community. And I'm seeing someone saying, I wrote a blog, I'm going to continue helping others, I feel hopeful for the future, I want to volunteer in my area, I'm going to accentuate the positive, I'm going to share Action for Happiness, I'm going to remind people how kindness and caring is contagious, I'm going to bring kindness into business, I'm going to share good news instead of negativity, I'm going to put more trust in each other and be kind. So even each of you doing those little things will, as we can see, have an impact on others and will help to restore our sort of faith in each other as well. Thank you everyone for being part of this event. In a moment, I will turn back to Lara and Radha for a final thought. But before we do that, I'd invite you all, wherever you are in the world, to join me for what we call the checkout, which is a quick process that has 3 steps. So first of all, take a pause and a breath and close your eyes if you want to, but just recenter with yourself. Notice how you're feeling right now, having heard all these really interesting insights and perhaps felt some emotional connection to them. And then bring your attention to something you feel appreciative of, maybe a new idea or an inspiring thought or a kind word you saw in the chat, and just try and hold that in mind, that appreciation, perhaps your appreciation for Lara and Radha for making time to be with us here today. And then the last step is we're going to send that sort of appreciation out beyond this group. We're so lucky to be here together, to be already aware that this stuff matters, to be connected to these experts. And there are so many around the world that could do with more of this, to feel that sense of kindness and optimism, to be reminded that other people care about them, especially if they're dealing with difficult times. So take a moment to send out a kind of well-wishing beyond us around the world at a time where so many are facing hardship. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. And I'm going to turn back to Lara for a final thought. What would you like to leave us with, Lara?
So much, but I first just want to say I am grateful and humbled to be here. I'm watching these comments come in and I am just inspired by all the optimism and kindness in this chat. I also just want to acknowledge, Mark, as I think you did at the beginning, I mean, right now, it can feel hard to be it can feel hard to be optimistic with the world in a pretty difficult place. And sometimes I think from the outside, might seem like a pursuit of happiness can feel like a selfish pursuit in the grand scheme of what's going on. But on the contrary, I think this report and this session kind of emphasizes how acts of kindness and the happiness it brings kind of inspires subsequent pro-social action, and how I really think it is such a catalyst for change that, hopefully it can help. I mean, not naively solve all the world's problems, but move it in the right direction as we start to find more kindness, compassion, caring, and well-being for ourselves and other people.
That's a beautiful vision. Thank you. Radha, what would you like to say as a sort of final thought?
Well, it's probably really the title of Action for Happiness, which is about action, I think. So, as Laura quite rightly says, every time we think of doing something kind or we want to be kind, I would just encourage everyone, including myself, just to act on that. Action brings momentum, it brings change, but also it can bring lots of positive impacts as well on all of us. So yeah, I would just say, I think for all of us, if you're unsure, if you're not, if you think about doing something that's kind, and that includes for yourself, then do it. So it's the action part, I think, which I'd like to leave everyone with tonight.
Thank you, both of you, for your expertise, for your generosity in being here, for everything you've contributed. And thank you to everyone who's been participating in this. Let's remember that there's more goodness in the world than we tend to be told there is. People are kinder than we think we are, and we can play a role in spreading that more around the world and in our lives as well. Thank you all so much. See you again soon.